Hi, I'm Elwayne. The night my wife's family called me a failure at their exclusive dinner reservation, I had already helped a stranded stranger fix his flat tire in the rain. Because of that kindness, I arrived late, soaked, and embarrassed. They made sure I knew exactly where I stood, at the servants' table, treated like hired help rather than family. But here's what they didn't know about the man I'd helped on that dark highway. When he walked into that same restaurant wearing a perfectly tailored suit, he didn't just recognize me, he owned the place. And what he revealed next didn't just expose my wife's family's cruel games. It shattered the foundation of lies they built their entire social status on. Want to know how one act of kindness turned their night of humiliation into my moment of triumph? How I discovered their darkest secrets and watched their empire crumble in real time. This is that story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October rain had that bitter edge that cuts through your jacket and settles into your bones. I was running 20 minutes behind schedule, driving through the winding roads of Blackwood Hills, trying to make it to Le Bernardin Noir before Kalis's family decided I was even more worthless than they already believed. The windshield wipers fought against the downpour, creating a rhythm that matched my anxious heartbeat. That's when I saw the hazard lights blinking through the storm like a distress signal nobody else seemed to notice. A silver sedan sat tilted on the shoulder of the highway, its rear tire completely flat. A man in his 50s stood beside it, soaked to the skin, holding a phone up toward the dark sky like he was trying to catch a signal from heaven itself. I slowed down, my conscience wrestling with my schedule. Kalis had already sent 3 texts asking where I was. Her mother, Thessia Mornell, had made the reservation at the most exclusive restaurant in Millbrook Heights specifically for tonight's family discussion. I knew what that meant. Another opportunity for them to remind me that a construction foreman from the wrong side of town would never be good enough for their precious daughter. But seeing that man standing there, shoulders hunched against the rain, I couldn't just drive past. My father had taught me better than that. You measure a man by what he does when nobody's watching, he used to say while working on our old pickup truck in the garage. Help folks when they need it, son. That's what separates us from the animals. I pulled over, hazard lights joining his in their urgent dance against the storm. Need some help? I called out as I jogged toward him, rain immediately soaking through my good shirt, the only dress shirt I owned that didn't have paint stains on it. The man looked up, relief flooding his weathered face. Oh, thank God. My phone's dead and I've been out here for 40 minutes. Tire just gave out completely. He gestured helplessly at the shredded rubber. I'm Sylvan, by the way. Sylvan Morish. Elwayne, I replied, already rolling up my sleeves. Let's get you back on the road. Sylvan's trunk was organized like a military operation. Emergency kit, first aid supplies, jumper cables, and thankfully, a spare tire that looked like it had never seen pavement. But as we started working, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a 5-minute fix. The lug nuts had been over-tightened by some overzealous mechanic, probably using an impact wrench set to maximum torque. These are really stuck, I grunted, throwing my full weight behind the tire iron. Rain streamed down my face as I worked, my dress shoes slipping on the wet asphalt. Whoever put this wheel on really didn't want it coming off. Sylvan held an umbrella over me, though it did little good in the sideways rain. I can't tell you how much I appreciate this. Most people would have just driven by. My wife's family would say this is exactly why I'm always behind schedule, I said, finally feeling one of the nuts give way. They think stopping to help people is just an excuse for poor time management. Sounds like they don't know much about character, Sylvan replied quietly. As I worked, we talked. Sylvan told me about his daughter's wedding next month, how he'd been driving back from the venue where they'd just finished the final walkthrough. I shared that I was headed to what would probably be another evening of subtle insults disguised as family concern about my career prospects. 23 years I've been in construction, I explained, wrestling with another stubborn lug nut. Started as a day laborer, worked my way up to foreman. I run crews of 30 guys, manage million-dollar projects, never missed a deadline. But because I don't wear a suit to work, because I actually use my hands for a living, I'm somehow not successful enough. The spare tire was smaller than the original, one of those temporary donuts meant to get you to a tire shop, but it would hold. As I tightened the final lug nut, Sylvan reached into his wallet. "Let me give you something for your trouble," he said, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. I stood up, wiping my grimy hands on my already ruined shirt. "Keep your money. Just pay it forward when you see someone else who needs help." Sylvan stared at me for a long moment, rain dripping from his gray hair. "You know, in my line of work I meet a lot of people. Most of them want something from me. But you," he shook his head, "you're the real deal, aren't you?" "I'm just a guy who knows how to change a tire," I said, gathering up the tools. "No," Sylvan said firmly, "you're much more than that. And I hope someday the people in your life realize it before it's too late." We shook hands, his grip firm and grateful, mine still slick with rain and road grime. As I watched his taillights disappear into the storm, I felt that familiar warmth that comes from doing the right thing, even when it costs you something. But that warmth faded quickly when I looked at my phone. 3 more missed calls from Kalis, and now I was almost an hour late. My reflection in the car window looked like I'd been wrestling with machinery in a monsoon, which wasn't far from the truth. My shirt was torn at the shoulder, my pants were stained with grease and mud, and my hair was plastered to my head like seaweed. I tried calling Kalis as I drove, but she didn't answer. By the time I reached Le Bernard Noir, the valet gave me the kind of look usually reserved for people trying to return moldy food at expensive grocery stores. The restaurant sat like a jewel in the heart of Millbrook Heights shopping district, all glass and black marble, with soft lighting that made everything look like it belonged in a magazine. Inside, the maître d' looked me up and down with barely concealed disgust. His name tag read Claude, and his expression suggested he'd never seen anything quite as offensive as my appearance. "I'm here for the mornal party," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Claude's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. "The mornal reservation? Are you certain?" "Elwayne Drellin. I'm married to Kalis Norwick Mornell." He consulted his tablet with the reverence of a priest reading scripture. "I see. Right this way, sir." The dining room was exactly what I'd expected. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths so crisp they could cut glass, and the kind of quiet murmur that comes from people who never have to worry about money. I spotted Kalis's family immediately. They sat at a corner table that commanded a view of the entire restaurant, positioned like royalty surveying their kingdom. Thessia Mornell, Kalis's mother, wore diamonds that caught the light like captured starfire. Her husband, Fendril Caro, looked like he'd stepped out of a country club catalog, all silver hair and perfectly pressed blazer. Kalis's sister, Orlisa Bronvel, sat beside her husband, Kalor Vinreth, both of them dressed like they were attending a state dinner rather than a family meal. And there was Kalis, beautiful as always in her navy dress, looking mortified as every head in the restaurant turned to watch her muddy, disheveled husband approach their table. "Elwayne," Thessia said, her voice carrying that particular tone that could freeze water at 20 paces. "How thoughtful of you to finally join us. We were beginning to think you'd gotten lost." The silence at the table was deafening as I approached, my wet shoes squelching against the polished marble floor. Every step felt like a declaration of my inadequacy, broadcast to the entire restaurant through the sound of water dripping from my clothes onto their pristine flooring. "Sorry I'm late," I began, pulling out the chair next to Kalis. "There was a man stranded on the highway and I—" "Of course there was," Thessia interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut crystal. She didn't look at me directly, instead addressing her words to the air somewhere above my left shoulder. "How very predictable." Kalis finally looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but shame. Pure, undiluted shame that I was her husband, sitting at this table, in this restaurant, looking like I just crawled out of a drainage ditch. "Elwayne," she whispered, "what happened to you? I told you, there was a man with a flat tire." "And you just had to stop," Fendril said, cutting me off with a wave of his manicured hand. "Because that's what you do, isn't it? You find excuses to avoid situations where you might have to actually be present, be accountable." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Helping someone isn't an excuse. It's the right thing to do. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Orlise let out a small laugh, the kind that sounds like breaking glass. "The right thing, how noble. Tell me, Elwayne, what was the right thing when you missed Kalis's promotion dinner last month because you were helping your neighbor move? Or when you were late to our anniversary celebration because you stopped to help some stranger jumpstart their car. Those were emergencies. No, Kaylor interjected, leaning back in his chair like a judge pronouncing sentence. Those were choices. Choices that consistently prioritize strangers over family. It shows a fundamental lack of judgment and priorities. The waiter appeared at my elbow, a young man with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd drawn the short straw when it came to serving our table. "Can I get you anything to drink, sir?" Before I could answer, Thesia spoke up. "Water will be fine. He won't be staying long enough for anything else." The waiter's eyes darted between us, clearly uncomfortable with the tension crackling across the table like static electricity. He hurried away, probably grateful to escape the battlefield our corner had become. "Now then," Thesia continued, smoothing her napkin across her lap with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. "Since you're finally here, we can discuss why we've all gathered tonight." I looked around the table, suddenly aware that this wasn't just a family dinner. This was an intervention, a carefully orchestrated performance with me as the unwilling star. The positioning of the chairs, the timing, the location, all of it had been planned to maximize my discomfort and their control. "We've been patient, Elwayne," Fendrel began, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We've watched you drag our daughter down for 3 years now. Your lack of ambition, your stubborn refusal to better yourself, your constant need to play hero to every random person you encounter on the street." "I have ambition," I said, my voice sounding weaker than I intended. "I'm good at what I do. I provide for Kalis." "Provide?" Orlise laughed again, that same brittle sound. "You rent a 2-bedroom apartment in Riverside Commons. That's not providing, that's barely surviving. Kaylor and I just bought our second home in the Hamptons. That's what providing looks like." Kalis hadn't said a word since I sat down. She stared at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her finger like she was trying to unscrew it. The ring I'd saved for 6 months to buy, working overtime and weekend shifts until my hands bled and my back screamed in protest. "The truth is," Thesia continued, "we're concerned about Kalis's future. She has a master's degree from Columbia. She works for one of the most prestigious marketing firms in the city. She has opportunities, connections, a chance at a real life. But she's being held back." "By me," I said, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. "By your circumstances," Fendrel corrected smoothly. "Your background, your social circle, your complete inability to understand how the world actually works. Look at yourself right now, Elwayne. Look around this restaurant. Do you see anyone else who looks like they just finished wrestling with a diesel engine?" I glanced around the dining room, taking in the sea of crisp suits, elegant dresses, and perfectly coiffed hair. The other diners looked like they'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, while I looked like I'd stepped out of a construction site during a mud season. "Success isn't just about working hard," Kaylor added, his tone suggesting he was explaining something simple to someone very slow. "It's about presentation, networking, understanding social dynamics. It's about knowing when to stop and when to keep driving, if you understand my meaning." The waiter returned with my water, setting it down with shaking hands before retreating as quickly as possible. I took a sip, trying to buy myself time to think, to find the words that might salvage this situation. "I know I'm not perfect," I began, "but I love Kalis. I work hard to give her everything I can." "Everything you can isn't enough," Thesia said bluntly. "It never will be. You're asking her to settle for a life that's beneath her capabilities, beneath her breeding, beneath everything she was raised to expect." "Mother," Kalis finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, darling. Someone needs to say this. We've been dancing around it for too long." Thesia turned her full attention to me for the first time since I'd arrived, her gray eyes cold as winter steel. "You're a failure, Elwayne. Not as a person, perhaps, but as a husband for our daughter. You consistently make choices that demonstrate your inability to prioritize what's truly important." The word hung in the air between us like a physical thing. Failure. It echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls of every insecurity I'd ever had. Every moment I'd wondered if I was enough, if I deserved someone like Kalis. "Tonight is a perfect example," Orlise continued, apparently not satisfied with the devastation her mother had already wrought. "We specifically asked you to be here at 7 o'clock. We made this reservation weeks ago. We coordinated everyone's schedules. And you show up looking like you've been working under a car, nearly an hour late, because you couldn't resist playing Good Samaritan to some random stranger. What was I supposed to do? I asked, hearing the desperation creeping into my voice. Leave him stranded in the storm? Yes, Fendrell said without hesitation. That's exactly what you were supposed to do. Call AAA, call the police, call someone whose job it is to help stranded motorists. Your job was to be here, with your family, presenting yourself as someone worthy of our daughter's time and affection. I looked at Kayla's, hoping to see some sign of support, some indication that she disagreed with her family's assessment. Instead, I saw her nodding slightly, her lips pressed together in a thin line. The truth is, she said quietly, not meeting my eyes, they're not wrong, Elwayne. You do this constantly. You prioritize everyone else over us, over me. I've been trying to ignore it, trying to make excuses, but I can't anymore. The restaurant seemed to tilt around me, the elegant surroundings blurring at the edges. The murmur of conversation from other tables faded to a distant hum, replaced by the thundering of my own heartbeat in my ears. We think, Thesia said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a medical diagnosis, it would be best if you took some time to reassess your priorities. Perhaps consider whether this marriage is truly serving either of you. The words hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white against the pristine tablecloth, trying to steady myself in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath my feet. And that's when he walked in. Through the blur of my humiliation, I almost didn't recognize him at first. The man who approached our table wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than I made in a month, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you belong wherever you choose to stand. His silver hair was styled impeccably, and he moved through the restaurant like he owned every marble tile beneath his feet. It was Sylvain Maurice, the stranded motorist I'd helped less than 2 hours ago. But before I could process this transformation, before I could understand what was happening, the maitre d' appeared at his side like a shadow given form. Mr. Maurice, Claude said, his voice carrying a deference I'd never heard him use with anyone else. We weren't expecting you this evening. Shall I prepare your usual table? That won't be necessary, Claude, Sylvain replied, his eyes scanning the dining room until they found mine. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. Not the grateful expression of a man I'd helped, but something deeper, more knowing. I believe I'll be joining this table. The silence that fell over our corner was absolute. Thesia's fork froze halfway to her mouth, a piece of artisanal salmon trembling on its tines. Fendrell's face went through several shades of confusion before settling on something that might have been panic. Orlis and Kaylor exchanged glances like people trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Only Kayla seemed to find her voice. I'm sorry, but I think there's been some mistake. This is a private family dinner. No mistake, Sylvain said, pulling out the empty chair directly across from me. I'm exactly where I need to be. Though I should properly introduce myself to those who don't already know me. His eyes swept the table before settling on Thesia. Sylvain Maurice, owner and proprietor of Les Bernardins Noirs, among other establishments. The collective intake of breath around the table was audible. Thesia's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Fendrell's hand tightened around his wine glass until I thought it might shatter. But it was Kayla's reaction that cut deepest. Her eyes darted between Sylvain and me, a dawning realization spreading across her features like spilled wine on white fabric. You own this place? She whispered. Among others, Sylvain repeated, settling into his chair with the ease of someone who had never questioned his right to be anywhere. 15 restaurants across 3 states, actually. But Le Bernardin Noir is my flagship, my pride and joy. I like to check in personally from time to time, ensure that our service standards are being maintained. He gestured to a waiter, who appeared instantly with the kind of attention usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. The usual, please, Henri. And perhaps some champagne for the table. Dom Perignon 2010, I think. We have something to celebrate. Celebrate? Thesia managed to croak. Oh yes, Sylvain said, his smile widening. You see, Mrs. Mornell, your son-in-law saved my life tonight. Well, perhaps that's dramatic, but he certainly saved my evening, my dignity, and possibly my daughter's wedding. He turned to me, and I saw genuine warmth in his eyes. When I told you to pay it forward, Elwayne, I never imagined I'd have the opportunity to return the favor so quickly. The champagne arrived with military precision, crystal flutes appearing as if by magic. The bottle opened with barely a whisper of cork against silver. Henri poured with the reverence of someone conducting a sacred ritual. "Now then," Sylvan continued, raising his glass, "I believe you were in the middle of a family discussion when I arrived. Something about priorities and success, if I overheard correctly." Fendrel cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control over the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Mr. Morich, we certainly appreciate your gratitude toward Elwayne, but this is really a private matter." "Is it?" Sylvan interrupted, his tone still pleasant but carrying an edge that made everyone sit up straighter. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're berating a man for possessing the exact qualities that built my business empire. Integrity, selflessness, the willingness to help others without expectation of reward." He took a sip of champagne, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Tell me, Mr. Caro. It is Caro, isn't it? What line of work are you in?" Fendrel straightened his tie, a gesture that struck me as oddly defensive. "I'm a financial advisor. I manage investment portfolios for high-net-worth individuals." "Ah, managing other people's money. How interesting." Sylvan's tone suggested it was anything but. "And you, Mrs. Mornell? How do you spend your days?" Thessia's chin lifted with the kind of practiced arrogance that comes from never having been truly challenged. "I'm involved in several charitable organizations. The Museum Board, the Children's Hospital Foundation, the Historic Preservation Society." "Charitable work. Admirable," Sylvan nodded thoughtfully. "And you, young lady?" He turned to Orlise. "I'm an interior designer," she said, her voice smaller than it had been moments before. "Design work. Creative." Sylvan's attention moved to Kaylor. "And you?" "Corporate law. Mergers and acquisitions." "Law. Very respectable." Sylvan set down his glass and folded his hands on the table. "Now, let me tell you about my evening. I was driving back from my daughter's wedding venue, a $2 million affair at Westfield Manor, if you're familiar with it, when my tire blew out on one of the most dangerous stretches of highway in the county, in the middle of a thunderstorm." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the table like a heavy blanket. "I stood there for 40 minutes, watching dozens of cars pass by. BMWs, Mercedes, Teslas, vehicles driven by people who, I'm sure, consider themselves successful, important, worthy of respect. Not one stopped. Not one even slowed down." Kalis was staring at me now, her expression unreadable. Then along came a pickup truck, driven by a construction worker in his only good shirt, already late for what was clearly an important engagement. He could have kept driving. Lord knows he had every excuse. But he didn't. He stopped, got soaked, ruined his clothes, and spent 30 minutes of his life helping a complete stranger, asking for nothing in return. Sylvan reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather portfolio, setting it on the table between us. "That construction worker, that failure, as I believe you called him, Mrs. Mornell, demonstrated more character in 30 minutes than most people show in a lifetime." The portfolio lay unopened, but somehow it dominated the table, radiating importance like a nuclear reactor radiates heat. "I've built a hospitality empire worth $200 million, Sylvan continued conversationally. "I employ over 3,000 people across 15 states. I've been featured on the cover of Forbes twice, and I sit on the boards of 7 major corporations. And do you know what I've learned in 40 years of business?" No one answered. No one seemed capable of speech. Success isn't measured by the size of your bank account or the exclusivity of your social circle. It's measured by who you are when nobody's watching, when there's nothing in it for you, when helping someone else costs you something you can't afford to lose. He opened the portfolio, revealing documents that looked official and important. Which brings me to why I'm really here tonight. You see, I don't just own restaurants. I own this entire building. The restaurant, the office spaces above, the retail shops below. All of it. Thessia's face had gone from pale to gray. Fendrel looked like he might be having a heart attack. "Now, I understand that some of you work in this building. Mrs. Mornell, isn't your foundation's office on the 3rd floor? And Mr. Caro, don't you lease space on the 7th floor for your financial consulting firm?" The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant clink of silverware from other tables, and the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. Sylvan smiled, But it wasn't a warm expression anymore. It was the smile of a shark who had just caught the scent of blood in the water. The portfolio remained closed on the table between us, but its presence seemed to grow larger with each passing second. Sylvan's revelation about owning the building had drained the color from half the faces around our table, and I was beginning to understand that this dinner had taken a turn none of us, least of all me, had anticipated. "You look surprised," Sylvan observed, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp as surgical steel. "Did you think a man who owns 15 restaurants might not have other business interests? Real estate has always been the backbone of wealth building, after all." Thessia tried to recover first, her voice shaky but determined. "Mr. Moorish, I'm sure we can discuss any business matters at a more appropriate time." "Oh, but this is the perfect time," Sylvan interrupted smoothly. "You see, I make it a practice to know my tenants personally. It helps me understand whether they're the kind of people I want representing my properties, my brand, my values." He gestured to Henri, who appeared instantly with a fresh bottle of wine, something that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. As the sommelier went through his ritual, Sylvan continued speaking in that same measured tone. "Take your foundation, for instance, Mrs. Mornell. The Children's Hospital Foundation. Very worthy cause. I've donated to similar organizations myself. Tell me, what's your annual operating budget?" Thessia blinked rapidly, clearly trying to process the shift from family intervention to business interrogation. We operate on approximately $1.2 million annually. And your overhead costs, administrative expenses? That's rather detailed. 40%, Sylvan said quietly. 40% of every dollar donated goes to administrative costs, salaries, office expenses, travel, entertainment. The national average for efficiently run charities is 18%. The wine Henri had been pouring seemed to freeze mid-pour. Even the waiter sensed the shift in atmosphere. "Those are complex calculations," Fendrel interjected, trying to come to his wife's defense. "Charity work requires significant infrastructure." "Indeed it does," Sylvan agreed. "Which is why I'm particularly interested in the consulting fees your foundation pays to Caro Financial Services. $60,000 annually for investment management of a portfolio worth less than $500,000. That's a 12% fee, Mr. Caro. Most investment advisors charge 1 to 2%. Fendrel's face had gone from gray to green. "There are additional services included in that fee structure." "Of course there are." Sylvan's smile never wavered. "Just as I'm sure there are perfectly reasonable explanations for why your daughter Orlise's interior design firm received no bid contracts worth $250,000 to redecorate the foundation's offices every 18 months. Orlise's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound like breaking promises. Henri materialized with a dustpan and brush, cleaning up the mess with the efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with disasters. And young Mr. Weinretz's law firm, Sylvan continued relentlessly, handles all the foundation's legal work at premium rates, despite most of the actual legal needs being simple document reviews that could be handled by a paralegal. Kaylor's face had taken on the expression of a man watching his career explode in slow motion. "Those are standard industry practices. Standard for firms that prey on non-profits run by people who don't understand business," Sylvan corrected. "Less standard for organizations genuinely committed to their charitable mission." I sat in stunned silence, watching this systematic dismantling of everything I'd been told about my own inadequacy. These people who had spent the evening explaining my failures, my lack of understanding about how the world works, were being exposed as the kind of people who turn charity into a family profit center. "Now," Sylvan said, finally opening the portfolio, "this brings me to my real concern. You see, I've been considering whether to renew the leases for several tenants in this building. Market rates have increased significantly, and I'm being very selective about the kind of businesses I want to associate with my properties." He pulled out a thick document and set it in the center of the table. Even upside down, I could see it was some kind of lease agreement, dense with legal language and official-looking seals. "The Mornell Foundation's lease expires at the end of this month, as does Caro Financial's office lease, Orlise Design Studio's lease expires in 60 days. And Vinrith and Associates' lease runs out in March." The implications hit the table like a physical wave. 4 businesses, all family-owned, all apparently dependent on leases controlled by the man sitting across from me, the man I'd helped change a tire in the rain. "Surely," Thessia began, her voice barely above a whisper, "you wouldn't make business decisions based on a personal disagreement." "Personal disagreement?" Sylvan laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Mrs. Mornell, you just spent the better part of an hour explaining to your daughter why she should divorce her husband because he lacks character, judgment, and success. You called him a failure. You suggested his willingness to help others demonstrated poor priorities." He leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, like a man holding all the cards in a poker game where the stakes kept climbing. "I'm simply applying your own standards. You've made it clear that success is measured by wealth, social position, and the ability to prioritize business relationships over human decency. By those metrics, how should I evaluate tenants who use a children's charity as their personal ATM?" Kalis, who had been silent through most of this exchange, finally found her voice. "This is insane. You can't destroy people's livelihoods over—" "Over what?" Sylvan's attention shifted to her, and for the first time, his expression softened slightly. "Over the fact that they spent an hour systematically humiliating the man who saved my evening? Over the fact that they called integrity a weakness and selflessness a failure?" He reached into his jacket again and pulled out his phone. "Would you like to know what I did while you were all explaining Elwayne's character defects? I made some calls. Professional curiosity, you understand." The phone screen glowed as he scrolled through what appeared to be notes. "The Better Business Bureau has received 17 complaints about Caro Financial in the past 2 years. Excessive fees, poor communication, questionable investment strategies. The State Attorney General's office has an open investigation into your foundation's financial practices, Mrs. Mornell. 3 complaints about billing disputes with Orleans Design Studio, and Mr. Vinrith's firm is facing a disciplinary hearing with the Bar Association next month." Each revelation landed like a physical blow. I watched the people who had been so confident in their superiority just minutes ago crumble under the weight of their own contradictions. "But here's what I find most interesting," Sylvan continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "In 3 years of investigating potential business partners, interviewing employees, vetting contractors, and researching community leaders, not once have I heard Elwayne Drellin's name associated with anything questionable. No complaints, no ethical lapses, no cutting corners." He closed his phone and slid it back into his jacket. His construction crews have never missed a deadline. His safety record is impeccable. His subcontractors speak of him with genuine respect. His employees actually smile when they talk about working for him. The restaurant around us continued its elegant dance, servers gliding between tables, wine glasses catching the light, quiet conversations and gentle laughter creating a soundtrack of civilized dining. But our table had become an island of reckoning in that sea of normalcy. "So here's what we're going to do," Sylvan said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that changed lives. "I'm going to give you all exactly what you've been asking for tonight, a chance to prove your worth according to your own standards." He pulled several documents from the portfolio, spreading them across the table like a dealer, revealing cards. "New lease agreements, market rate, plus 20% premium for what I'll call character assessment fees. Due diligence deposits of $50,000 each, non-refundable, to demonstrate your commitment to ethical business practices going forward." The numbers hit the table like physical blows. I watched Fendrel's face cycle through confusion, anger, and something that might have been panic. Thessia's perfectly manicured fingers gripped her napkin until her knuckles went white. "Additionally," Sylvan continued, "I'll be requiring quarterly audits of all your business practices, conducted by independent firms of my choosing at your expense. Any deviation from the highest ethical standards will result in immediate lease termination." "You can't do this," Kaylor said, his lawyer's training finally kicking in. "This is extortion, harassment." "This is business," Sylvan corrected smoothly. "I'm simply applying the same standards of success and accountability that you've spent the evening explaining to me. Surely people of your caliber can meet these reasonable requirements." The trap was perfect, elegant in its simplicity. They could accept his terms and prove they were willing to live by their own standards. Or they could refuse and admit that their definitions of success only applied to other people. The leather portfolio dominated our table now like some ancient artifact of judgment, its contents spread across the white tablecloth in a display that transformed our corner of Le Bernardin Noir into a courtroom. The soft jazz continued playing, Other diners carried on their elegant conversations, but our table had become the epicenter of something that transcended mere dinner conversation. Sylvan sat back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who had just laid out his hand in a game where he held all the aces. The lease agreements, audit requirements, and financial demands formed a paper barrier between him and the people who had spent the evening explaining why I was a failure. "I need to make a phone call," Thesia announced suddenly, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that made several nearby diners glance over. "Of course," Sylvan said pleasantly. "Take your time. These decisions shouldn't be rushed." As Thesia hurried toward the restaurant's lobby, her phone already pressed to her ear, Fendrel leaned forward across the table. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by something more calculating, more desperate. "Mr. Moriche," he began, his tone carefully measured, "I think there may be some misunderstandings here. Perhaps we could discuss this privately, away from," his eyes flicked toward me, "family members who might not fully grasp the complexities of these business relationships." "On the contrary," Sylvan replied, his smile never wavering. "I think Elwayne should hear every word of this. After all, you've spent considerable time tonight educating him about success, business acumen, and proper priorities. I'm sure he's curious to see how those lessons apply in practice." Kaylor was scrolling through his phone with the frantic energy of someone looking for a lifeline. "I'm calling my senior partner," he announced. "These contract terms are unconscionable. No court would—" "Would what?" Sylvan interrupted gently. "Would enforce a landlord's right to set market-rate rents for his properties? Would uphold a property owner's decision to require higher standards from tenants who represent his business reputation?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a second phone. This one clearly a different device from the personal one he'd used earlier. The screen displayed what appeared to be a complex financial dashboard, with numbers that shifted in real time. "Would you like to know what I did while your family was explaining Elwayne's shortcomings?" Sylvan asked, his attention focused on the screen. "I had my property management team pull the financials on all your businesses. Fascinating reading." The phone's glow illuminated his face as he scrolled through data that clearly contained more than just lease information. "Caro Financial Services has been operating at a loss for 18 months. Your client base has shrunk by 40% since the market volatility began, and your average account balance has dropped from 2.8 million to 1.1 million. Fendrel's face went from red to ashen. "That's confidential information." "That's public record, properly researched," Sylvan corrected. "SEC filings, business registration renewals, insurance claims, Better Business Bureau reports. Amazing what you can learn when you know where to look." Orlise had been silent since her champagne glass shattered, but now she found her voice. "This is harassment. You're using your position to intimidate people who had nothing to do with—" "With what?" Sylvan's attention shifted to her with laser focus. "With calling the man who helped me a failure? With suggesting that integrity and selflessness are character flaws? With spending an hour systematically humiliating someone whose only crime was showing up late because he stopped to help a stranger?" He set the phone down and folded his hands on the table. "Let me tell you about harassment, Ms. Branville. Harassment is billing a children's charity 400% over market rate for interior design services they don't need. Harassment is coordinating with family members to create a closed-loop billing system that funnels charitable donations into personal bank accounts." The words hit like physical blows. I watched Orlise's face crumble as she realized the scope of what Sylvan had uncovered in what couldn't have been more than an hour of research. "But here's what I find most interesting," Sylvan continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "In all my research, and I've been very thorough, I found something remarkable about Elwayne." Every eye at the table turned toward me. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, examined by forces I didn't understand and couldn't control. "Drellin Construction has been operating in this region for 8 years, Sylvan said, consulting his phone again. 47 major projects completed. 0 safety violations. 0 missed deadlines. 0 complaints filed with the Better Business Bureau, the state licensing board, or any trade organization." He looked up from the screen, his eyes meeting mine directly. "That's not just rare in construction, Elwayne. That's unprecedented. I've built 15 restaurants, renovated dozens of properties, worked with hundreds of contractors. I've never seen a record that clean." The restaurant around us seemed to fade into background noise as Sylvan's words settled over the table like snow covering a battlefield. More interesting still, he continued, your employees have been with you an average of 4 years. In an industry where turnover typically runs 60 to 80% annually, your crew retention rate is 93%. Your subcontractors bid lower on jobs when they know you're the general contractor because they know they'll be paid on time and treated fairly. Kalis was staring at me now with an expression I couldn't read. Not the shame I'd seen earlier, but something else. Confusion, maybe, or the dawning realization that the man she'd married might not be who her family had convinced her he was. "The Riverside Commons apartment complex where you live?" Sylvan asked. "Your construction company rebuilt that entire structure after the fire 3 years ago. The property management company's records show you completed the job 18 days ahead of schedule and returned a check for $50,000 because the project came in under budget." He paused to let that sink in. In my peripheral vision, I could see Thessia returning from her phone call, her face grave. When's the last time anyone at this table returned money because they'd charged too much? Sylvan asked the question like he already knew the answer. Thessia slipped back into her seat, her earlier composure completely shattered. "I spoke with our attorney," she said quietly. "He says we have no choice but to accept whatever terms you're offering." "Interesting," Sylvan mused. "And what did your attorney say when you explained why you might need to renegotiate your lease agreements?" The silence stretched long enough for the waiter to refill our water glasses and retreat without making eye contact with anyone at the table. "He said," Thessia continued, her voice barely audible, "that property owners have broad discretion in setting rental terms and tenant requirements, especially when there are documented concerns about business practices." Sylvan nodded slowly. "Wise counsel, though I imagine he also mentioned that legal challenges to such decisions are expensive, time-consuming, and rarely successful." He began gathering the documents spread across the table, organizing them into neat stacks with the methodical precision of someone who had conducted many such negotiations. "However," he said, and something in his tone made everyone sit up straighter, "I'm not an unreasonable man. I believe in second chances, in the possibility of redemption, which is why I'm prepared to make an alternative offer." A new document appeared from the portfolio, thicker than the others, bound with ribbon like some kind of official proclamation. "These are the lease renewal agreements at current market rates. No premium, no additional deposits, no special audit requirements," Sylvan explained. "Standard terms, standard rates, standard tenant protections." Hope flickered across the faces around the table like candlelight in a gentle breeze. "There's only one condition," Sylvan continued. "A public apology, written, formal, published in the business section of the Herald Tribune. An acknowledgement that you were wrong about character, about success, about what makes a man worthy of respect." He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "And it has to be genuine, not lawyer speak, not corporate non-apology language. A real acknowledgement of harm done and lessons learned." The document lay on the table between us, tantalizingly close but separated by a chasm of pride and public humiliation. "The alternative," Sylvan said softly, "is exactly what I've already offered. Market plus 20%, $50,000 deposits, quarterly audits, and the constant scrutiny of a landlord who will be watching every move you make." The choice was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Save their businesses and their financial futures, but destroy their social standing and admit their fundamental wrongness about success, character, and human worth. Or maintain their pride and face financial ruin. I sat in stunned silence, watching the people who had spent the evening explaining my failures grapple with a choice between humility and destruction. The silence that followed Sylvan's ultimatum stretched across our table like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, competing with the gentle classical music that continued to play throughout the restaurant, as if nothing earth-shattering was happening in our corner of their elegant world. Thessia was the first to break. Her composure, which had been cracking steadily throughout the evening, finally shattered completely. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or laughter. It was impossible to tell which. "This is insane," she whispered through her fingers. "You're asking us to destroy our reputations over a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Sylvan's voice remained perfectly level, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. "Mrs. Mornell, Let me share with you exactly what I heard when I walked into this restaurant tonight. He reached into his jacket and pulled out yet another device. This one appeared to be a digital recorder, no larger than a credit card but clearly sophisticated. The small red light indicated it had been running. I believe in being thorough in my business dealings, Sylvan explained, setting the device on the table where everyone could see it. I started recording the moment I sat down. Would you like me to play back your exact words about your son-in-law? The blood drained from Thessia's face so quickly I thought she might faint. Around the table, the others stared at the recorder like it was a live grenade with the pin pulled. That's illegal, Kaylor said quickly, his legal training kicking in despite his obvious panic. Recording conversations without consent is perfectly legal in a public establishment where there's no reasonable expectation of privacy. Sylvan finished smoothly. I'm surprised a lawyer of your caliber wouldn't know that. Perhaps that's why your firm is facing disciplinary action with the Bar Association. Kaylor's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Orlise reached over and grabbed his hand, her own trembling visibly. But let's not get sidetracked by legal technicalities, Sylvan continued. Let's focus on the choice before you. I've laid out two paths forward. Both are completely legal, completely within my rights as a property owner, and completely in line with standard business practices. He pressed a button on the recorder. Thessia's voice filled the space between us, crystal clear and devastating in its cruelty. You're a failure, Elwayne. Not as a person, perhaps, but as a husband for our daughter. You consistently make choices that demonstrate your inability to prioritize what's truly important. The playback stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear the distant sound of other diners, conversations, the clink of silverware against fine china, the soft footsteps of servers moving through the restaurant. Normal sounds of normal people having normal evenings, oblivious to the reckoning happening just 20 feet away. Shall I continue? Sylvan asked pleasantly. I have particularly clear recordings of the comments about street trash and the suggestion that Elwayne's willingness to help others demonstrates poor judgment. Fendrel finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. What do you want from us? I want exactly what I've already offered, Sylvan replied. A choice. You can maintain your current narrative, that success is measured by wealth and social status, that helping others is a sign of weakness, that a man's worth is determined by his appearance at dinner parties rather than his character in crisis. If that's your position, then live by those standards. Accept the lease terms that reflect your own definition of success. He gestured to the standard lease agreements still sitting untouched on the table. Or you can acknowledge that perhaps your understanding of character, success, and human worth might need some revision. A simple, public acknowledgement of error. An apology for harm done. And we move forward with standard business terms. You're asking us to humiliate ourselves, Orlisa said, her voice barely audible. No, Sylvan corrected gently. I'm asking you to tell the truth. The humiliation you're feeling isn't coming from my request. It's coming from the recognition of what you've done. Kalis, who had been silent through most of this exchange, suddenly stood up so abruptly that her chair tipped backward. A waiter materialized instantly to steady it, but she didn't seem to notice. I need air, she announced, her voice tight with emotion. I need to get out of here. She turned and walked rapidly toward the restaurant's exit, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. I watched her go, torn between following her and staying to see how this surreal confrontation would end. Perhaps, Sylvan suggested kindly, you should go after your wife, Elwayne. This conversation can continue without you. In fact, it might be better if it did. I looked around the table at the faces of people who had spent years making me feel small, worthless, inadequate. Now they looked smaller than I had ever imagined possible. Thessia was still hiding behind her hands. Fendrel stared at the table as if it might open up and swallow him. Orlise and Kaylor huddled together like refugees from a natural disaster. Actually, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice, I think I'll stay. I've been told all evening that I don't understand how the world works. I'd like to see how it really works. Sylvan's smile was warm and genuine for the first time since he'd sat down. As you wish. Thessia finally looked up, her makeup streaked and her eyes red. Why are you doing this to us? We never did anything to you. You never did anything to me personally, that's true, Sylvan acknowledged. But you spent an hour systematically destroying a good man's self-worth for the crime of being late to dinner. Because he stopped to help a stranger. You called him a failure for possessing the exact qualities that any decent person should admire. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard before. More than that. You've built your entire social and financial structure on the exploitation of charitable organizations meant to help vulnerable people. You've turned a children's hospital foundation into your personal bank account. You've charged desperate clients excessive fees for substandard service. You've created a closed loop of mutual benefit that funnels money away from people who actually need help. The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. Around us, the restaurant continued its elegant dance, but our table had become an island of reckoning. "That's not, we never meant," Fendrell began, but Sylvan cut him off with a raised hand. "Let me tell you about the children's hospital," Sylvan said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "My granddaughter spent 3 months there 2 years ago. Leukemia. She's fine now, thanks to the incredible doctors and nurses who work there around the clock for wages that wouldn't cover your monthly entertainment budget." His eyes were hard as granite now. "Do you know what those doctors told me? They told me about programs that had to be cut because of insufficient funding. Art therapy sessions for sick kids canceled. Family support groups eliminated. Transportation assistance for parents who couldn't afford to stay near the hospital while their children fought for their lives discontinued." The weight of his words pressed down on the table like a physical presence. I found myself thinking about the calluses on my hands, the honest sweat of physical labor, the satisfaction of building something solid and real that would last. "Meanwhile," Sylvan continued, "your foundation was paying for office renovations every 18 months, charging 12% management fees on investments, and billing for consulting services that amounted to little more than family dinner conversations." Thessia's face had gone gray. "We had legitimate expenses." "You had legitimate greed," Sylvan corrected. "You found a way to feel good about yourselves while profiting from other people's generosity. You turned charity into a business model." He reached into his portfolio one more time and pulled out a thick folder. "These are the financial records for every children's hospital foundation in a 50-mile radius. Would you like to guess which one has the highest administrative overhead? Which one spends the smallest percentage of donations on actual charitable work?" The folder remained closed, but its presence was answer enough. "Now," Sylvan said, settling back in his chair, "let's talk about your choices. The premium lease terms I've offered reflect the true cost of doing business with people who view ethics as optional. The audit requirements ensure that future business practices meet basic standards of honesty. The deposits guarantee that you're financially committed to operating with integrity." He gestured toward the standard lease agreements. "Or you can publicly acknowledge that character matters more than appearance, that helping others is a sign of strength rather than weakness, that a man's worth isn't measured by his bank account or his punctuality at dinner parties." Fendrell was shaking his head slowly, like a man trying to wake up from a nightmare. "You're asking us to admit that everything we've built our lives on is wrong." "I'm asking you to admit that some of the things you built your lives on are wrong," Sylvan corrected. "There's a difference. You can still be successful, still have comfortable lives, still enjoy the benefits of hard work and good fortune. You just have to do it honestly." The silence stretched on. I could see them calculating, weighing their pride against their financial survival, their social standing against their professional futures. Finally, Kaylor spoke up, his voice hoarse. "If we were to consider the apology option, hypothetically, what exactly would you expect it to say?" Sylvan reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper. Apparently, he had come prepared for every contingency. "Something like this," he said, unfolding it and placing it where everyone could see. Even upside down, I could make out the heading, "A Public Apology in Acknowledgement of Error." The text below was dense with formal language, but the meaning was clear enough. "You've already written it?" Orlise asked, her voice hollow. "I believe in being prepared," Sylvan replied, "though of course you're free to draft your own version. As long as it contains a genuine acknowledgement of harm done and a commitment to better business practices going forward." The paper sat on the table like a contract with the devil, salvation offered at the price of public humiliation and the admission that their entire worldview had been fundamentally flawed. I looked around at these people who had spent so many years making me feel inadequate, and realized that for the first time in our relationship I felt something approaching pity for them. The pre-written apology lay on the table between us like evidence in a trial, its formal language catching the soft light from the chandeliers above. I could see fragments of phrases even from my position, words like misjudged, apologize unreservedly, and commitment to ethical practices going forward. Each phrase represented a nail in the coffin of their carefully constructed social superiority. Thesia reached for the document with trembling fingers, her movements slow and deliberate like someone handling a live explosive. As she read, her face cycled through expressions of horror, disbelief, and something that might have been grudging respect for Sylvan's thoroughness. "This is very specific," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I believe in clarity," Sylvan replied. Vague apologies that don't acknowledge specific harms aren't really apologies at all. They're just public relations exercises designed to minimize damage while admitting as little as possible. Fendrel leaned over to read alongside his wife, his face growing paler with each line. "You want us to admit to charging excessive fees, to misappropriating charitable funds, to creating what you call a corrupt network of mutual financial benefit at the expense of vulnerable populations." "I want you to admit to what you actually did," Sylvan corrected. "Though if you prefer, we can stick with the premium lease terms and quarterly audits. Those don't require any public statements at all." The trap was perfect in its construction. They could maintain their pride and face financial ruin, or they could save their businesses at the cost of their reputations. But there was a third option that none of them seemed to be considering. They could admit their wrongs, make genuine changes, and potentially emerge as better people. "There's something I don't understand," I said, surprised to hear my own voice cutting through the tension. Everyone turned to look at me, and for a moment I felt that familiar urge to shrink back, to apologize for speaking up. But something had changed in me during this evening. Why does admitting you were wrong have to be the end of the world? Thesia blinked at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. "Excuse me?" "I mean, people make mistakes, people have flawed perspectives, people change and grow. If you genuinely believe now that character matters more than appearance, that helping others is important, that business should be conducted ethically, isn't that actually a good thing?" Orlise was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "Elwayne, you don't understand. Our entire social circle, our business networks, our standing in the community, are built on lies," I finished. "Right? That's what we're talking about here. Your standing in the community is based on people believing you're something you're not." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This wasn't the silence of shock or fear, but the silence of people confronting an uncomfortable truth. Kaylor was the first to respond. "It's not that simple. Reputation is everything in business. Once you admit to ethical lapses, clients lose confidence, referrals dry up, competitors use it against you." "Bad clients lose confidence," Sylvan interjected. "The kind of clients who want to work with people who cut corners, who bend rules, who prioritize profit over principle. Good clients, the kind who pay their bills on time, who value quality work, who refer their friends because they trust your integrity. Those clients aren't looking for corner cutters." He pulled out his phone again, scrolling through what appeared to be contacts. "I know dozens of business owners who've publicly acknowledged mistakes, changed their practices, and ended up more successful than before. Not less successful, more successful. Because people trust businesses that are transparent about their failures and committed to doing better." Fendrel shook his head slowly. "You make it sound easy." "It's not easy," Sylvan acknowledged. "It's simple, but it's not easy. Easy would be maintaining the status quo, continuing to profit from charitable work while doing minimal actual charity, charging excessive fees because clients don't know better, using family connections to create closed-loop billing systems." He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "But simple doesn't mean easy. Apologizing genuinely, changing business practices, rebuilding relationships based on honesty rather than mutual exploitation. That's hard work. That's the kind of work that actually builds lasting success." At that moment, Henri appeared at our table with a telephone on a silver tray. "Mr. Morge, you have an urgent call. Your assistant says it concerns the Richmond property." Sylvan glanced at the phone, then at the faces around our table. "Take a message, Henri. This conversation is more important than real estate." The gesture was small, but its impact was enormous. Here was a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars, turning away from business to focus on what he clearly saw as a moral issue. The contrast with the people who had spent the evening explaining that business always came first was stark and unmistakable. "You know what I think?" I said, emboldened by Sylvan's example. "I think you're all terrified of discovering that doing the right thing might actually work better than what you've been doing." Thessia's head snapped toward me, her eyes flashing with something that looked like her old arrogance. "And what would you know about building a successful business, Elwayne? You've never managed anything more complex than a construction crew." "I've managed construction crews for 8 years," I replied, my voice steady. 47 major projects, 0 safety violations, 0 missed deadlines, 0 complaints. My employees stay with me for an average of 4 years in an industry where most people change jobs every 8 months. My subcontractors bid lower when they know I'm the general contractor because they trust me to pay them on time and treat them fairly. The words came out stronger than I'd intended, but I realized I was tired of apologizing for my success just because it didn't look like their definition of success. My business works because I treat people honestly. I deliver what I promise when I promise it. I don't charge for work I didn't do or materials I didn't provide. I don't take shortcuts that might save money today but cause problems tomorrow. I looked around the table at faces that were listening to me, really listening, for perhaps the first time since I'd known them. And you know what? It's not just more ethical. It's more profitable. I get repeat clients, referrals, word-of-mouth recommendations. I don't have to spend money on advertising because my reputation brings in new business. I don't have to worry about lawsuits or complaints or investigations because I do the work right the first time. Sylvan was nodding slowly, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Exactly. Ethical business practices aren't just morally superior. They're economically superior in the long term. Kayleigh chose that moment to return from whatever contemplation she'd been doing outside. She approached our table slowly, her face unreadable. Instead of sitting in her original chair next to me, she remained standing, her hands resting on the back of an empty chair. "I heard some of that from the lobby," she said quietly, "about honest business practices being more profitable." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Respect, maybe, or at least recognition. "I've been thinking about something," she continued, "about the difference between being successful and looking successful." Thessia started to speak, but Kayleigh held up a hand. "Mom, please, let me finish." She pulled out the chair and sat down, but not next to me. She positioned herself at the head of the table, equidistant from everyone, like a mediator in a negotiation. "I've spent 3 years being ashamed of my husband because he didn't look like what I thought success should look like. He wore work clothes to family dinners. He had dirt under his fingernails sometimes. He drove a pickup truck instead of a luxury sedan. He stopped to help strangers when we had somewhere important to be." Her voice was getting stronger as she spoke, more confident. "But he's built a business from nothing. He employs 30 people who can support their families because of work he created. He's never been sued, never been investigated, never been accused of cutting corners or cheating clients. His employees respect him. His clients trust him. His competitors bid against him and lose because his reputation for quality is unmatched." She turned to look directly at her family. "Meanwhile, we've built our success on charging desperate people excessive fees, billing charities for unnecessary services, and creating family networks that funnel money away from people who actually need help." Thessia's face had gone from pale to red. "Kayleigh, you don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Kayleigh replied firmly. "I've seen the Foundation's books. I've watched Dad charge clients 12% management fees for basic portfolio maintenance. I've seen Orlyse bill for design services that consisted of moving furniture around rooms that didn't need redecorating." She stood up again, pacing behind her chair like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "And I've watched Elwayne build something real, something solid, something that helps people and creates value and makes the world a little bit better. While we've been sitting in fancy restaurants talking about his failures." The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of people having their fundamental assumptions challenged by someone they thought was on their side. Finally, Sylvan spoke. "Mrs. Norwick Mornell, would you be willing to co-sign the apology?" Kayleigh looked at the apology document in Sylvan's hands, then at me, then back at her family. The restaurant around us continued its elegant rhythm. Soft conversations, the gentle clink of silverware, the whisper of servers moving between tables. But our corner had become a world unto itself, suspended in a moment that would define relationships and futures. "Yes," she said finally, her voice clear and strong, "I'll co-sign the apology. Because it's not just their apology to make. I've been part of this. I've been complicit." She turned to face me directly, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. "Elwayne, I owe you an apology too. Not a public one, but a personal one. I let them convince me that your kindness was weakness, that your integrity was naivete, that your success wasn't real success because it didn't look like what I thought it should look like." The words hit me harder than her family's cruelty had. Their attacks I could dismiss as the selfishness of people who didn't know me, but Kalis knew me. She'd seen me at my best and worst, and she'd chosen to believe the worst. "I convinced myself I was protecting our future by pushing you to be more like them," she continued. "But I was actually trying to destroy the very things that made me fall in love with you in the first place." Thesia made a sound that might have been protest, but Kalis held up her hand without looking away from me. "Your willingness to help strangers, your commitment to doing work you could be proud of, your loyalty to people who trusted you, those aren't character flaws. Those are the reasons our marriage has lasted 3 years despite my family's constant interference." She picked up the apology document and scanned it quickly. "This doesn't go far enough," she said to Sylvan. "It talks about business practices and ethical lapses, but it doesn't address the personal harm we've done, the systematic undermining of a good man's confidence, the years of making him feel like he wasn't enough." Sylvan nodded thoughtfully. "What would you add?" Kalis was quiet for a long moment, her eyes unfocused as she thought. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but heavy with emotion. "We need to acknowledge that we confused status with success, that we mistook appearance for substance, that we valued image over integrity. We need to admit that we were wrong about what makes a person worthy of respect." She looked around the table at her family, "And we need to commit to doing better, not just in business, but in how we treat people. All people, especially the people closest to us." Fendrel finally found his voice, though it came out rough and uncertain. "Kalis, you're talking about destroying everything we've built." "No, Dad. I'm talking about building something better on a foundation that won't crumble the moment someone shines a light on it." The transformation in Kalis was remarkable. The woman who had sat in shame an hour ago, unwilling to meet my eyes, had become someone I barely recognized. Stronger, clearer, more decisive than I'd seen her in years. "Mr. Morich," she said, turning back to Sylvan, "if my family chooses the premium lease terms rather than the apology, I want to make sure you know that not all of us agree with that choice." "And if they choose the apology but don't mean it," Sylvan asked, "if it's just words designed to save money rather than a genuine acknowledgement of harm done?" Kalis smiled for the first time all evening. "Then you'll know within 6 months, because real change shows up in actions, not just words." Thesia had been silent through this exchange, but now she looked up with something that might have been hope. "If we were to sign this apology, both versions, the business practices one and whatever personal acknowledgement Kalis is proposing, what guarantee do we have that this ends here?" "You have my word," Sylvan replied simply. "Standard lease terms, no special scrutiny, no ongoing harassment, clean slate, fresh start." "Your word," Kaylor repeated, his lawyer's training making him skeptical of verbal agreements. "My word," Sylvan confirmed, "which, in my experience, is worth more than most contracts." The silence that followed was different from all the others. This wasn't the silence of shock or fear or calculation. This was the silence of people standing at a crossroads, knowing that whatever choice they made would define not just their immediate future, but who they would be going forward. Orlise spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose my business, but I also don't want to keep running it the way I have been." She looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, her expression was free of condescension or judgment. "Elwayne, I'm sorry. For tonight, for all the nights before this one, for making you feel like you weren't good enough when the truth is I wasn't good enough to recognize your worth." The apology was simple, direct, and more powerful than any of the elaborate language in Sylvan's document. Kaylor cleared his throat. "I'll sign whatever version of the apology we end up with. And I'll mean it." Fendrel was nodding slowly. "We've made mistakes, serious ones. If admitting that publicly is the price of keeping our businesses and our integrity, then it's a price worth paying." All eyes turned to Thesia. The matriarch of the family, the one whose opinions had shaped their treatment of me for 3 years, the architect of the evening's humiliation. She sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the apology document. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I've spent so many years being afraid," she said. "Afraid that if people saw who we really were, they wouldn't respect us anymore. Afraid that if we admitted mistakes, people would think less of us. Afraid that kindness was weakness, and helping others was foolishness." She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Vulnerability, genuine remorse, and the beginning of something that might have been respect. I was wrong about everything, wasn't I? About what matters, about what success looks like, about what kind of man my daughter married. The admission hung in the air between us, simple and devastating and oddly beautiful. "Yes," I said quietly. "You were wrong about some things, but being wrong doesn't make you a bad person, it just makes you human." Thessia's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to undo years of treating you like you weren't good enough." "You start by treating me like I am good enough going forward," I replied. "You start by judging actions instead of appearances. You start by remembering that helping someone change a tire in the rain says more about character than showing up on time to dinner." Sylvan had been watching this exchange with the expression of someone witnessing something profound and rare. Now he reached into his portfolio and pulled out a pen. "Shall we draft a new version of this apology together?" he suggested. "One that addresses both the business practices and the personal harm? One that commits to specific changes going forward?" For the next 30 minutes, we worked together to craft something that was part business document, part personal reckoning, and part roadmap for better relationships. Thessia contributed language about the difference between status and respect. Fendril added commitments to transparent business practices. Orlise included acknowledgments about the harm done by constant criticism. Kaylor provided legal language that made the commitments binding without being punitive. And Kaylor wrote the section about marriage, about supporting rather than undermining, about celebrating character rather than demanding conformity. When we were finished, the document was longer than Sylvan's original, more personal, more specific, and infinitely more meaningful. "This will be published in tomorrow's business section," Sylvan said as they signed, "and I'll make sure copies go to the boards of every organization you work with." "Good," Thessia said, her signature firm and clear. "Accountability shouldn't be private." As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Sylvan pulled me aside. "I have a proposition for you, Elwayne. I'm developing a new property, a mixed-use complex with retail, office, and residential spaces. I need a general contractor I can trust completely, someone who delivers quality work on time and on budget. Someone who treats subcontractors fairly and puts integrity above profit. Interested?" The project he described was easily the largest I'd ever been offered, the kind of job that could transform my business from successful to genuinely prosperous. "Why me?" I asked. Sylvan smiled. "Because when a stranger needed help on a dark highway, you stopped. Everything else I need to know about your character, I learned in those 30 minutes in the rain." 3 months later, I was standing in the lobby of the Millbrook Business Journal, reading the follow-up article about the changes at the Mornell Foundation. Administrative overhead had dropped from 40% to 12%. New programs had been launched. The foundation had received its highest charity rating in 5 years. Similar transformations had occurred at Caro Financial, Orlise Design Studio, and Vinreth and Associates. Not overnight, and not without genuine effort, but the changes were real and measurable. My phone buzzed with a text from Kalis. "Dinner tonight? The little place on 5th Street. The one where they don't care what you wear as long as you're kind to the servers." I smiled and typed back, "It's a date." Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest choice: stopping to help a stranger, admitting you were wrong, choosing integrity over image. That night at Le Bernardin Noir, I learned that success isn't about proving you're better than other people. It's about becoming better than you were yesterday. And sometimes, helping someone change a tire in the rain changes everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.